The Galactic Council chamber fell silent as Ambassador Veltar of the Zephyrian Empire stepped forward, his crystalline form catching the ambient light and casting rainbow patterns across the assembled delegates. The chamber itself was a marvel of engineering, a spherical structure suspended in the void between three star systems, accessible only through quantum tunneling technology that most species considered impossible until they witnessed it firsthand. Honored beings of the Council, Veltar began, his voice resonating through translation matrices that converted his harmonic speech into comprehensible formats for the 847 different species present. We gather today to discuss a matter of grave importance that threatens the very fabric of our civilized galaxy. Elder Thexma of the ancient Kithara leaned forward on her hover throne, her 6 eyes blinking in sequence. At over 3,000 years old, she was one of the few beings present who remembered the time before the Great Accords, when warfare between species was common and entire star systems burned in conflicts that lasted centuries. Her voice carried the weight of eons when she spoke. "Speak plainly, Veltar. What brings the Zephyrian Empire before us with such urgency that you invoke emergency protocols?" Veltar's form flickered slightly, a sign of deep distress among his people. "Honored Elder, it concerns the humans." A wave of murmurs swept through the chamber. The word human was spoken in hushed tones, carrying with it centuries of legend and carefully maintained distance. Most species in the galaxy knew of humans only through whispered stories and classified reports that were locked away in the deepest archives of their governments. "The humans have been in isolation for over 400 years, spoke Commander Zixal of the hegemony, his metallic voice cutting through the murmurs. The quarantine protocols were established for good reason. They agreed to voluntary exile after the incidents. That is precisely the issue, Veltar replied, his form solidifying as he prepared to deliver news that would shake the foundations of galactic civilization. 3 days ago, a Zephyrian mining expedition in the Kepler sector discovered something that violates every treaty, every accord, and every understanding we have maintained for the past 4 centuries. The chamber's lighting dimmed automatically as Veltar activated a holographic display. The three-dimensional image showed a star system that most delegates recognized as being within the quarantine zone around Earth. But what drew gasps from the assembled beings was not the familiar yellow star or the blue-green world orbiting it. It was the massive structure that dominated the space between the 3rd and 4th planets. "By the 7 suns," whispered Ambassador Crevier of the Traitors Alliance, her tentacles curling in shock. "What is that?" The structure was impossibly large, easily the size of small moon, but it was clearly artificial. Its surface was a complex lattice of metal and energy conduits that pulsed with an ominous blue-white light. Most disturbing of all, it was aimed directly at the galactic core, where the Council's headquarters and most advanced civilizations were located. "Our analysis suggests it is some form of weapon," Veltar continued, his voice growing more strained. "The energy readings are unlike anything in our databases. The humans have been building this in secret, in direct violation of the technology limitation treaties they signed as part of their exile agreement." Elder Thexma's ancient eyes narrowed as she studied the hologram. She had been present when the original treaties were signed, had witnessed firsthand why the galaxy's elder species had agreed that humans needed to be contained. The memory of burning worlds and species-wide extinctions still haunted her dreams. "Have there been any attempts at communication?" she asked. "That is where this matter becomes even more troubling," Veltar replied. "Our mining crew was detected by human patrol ships. Instead of the usual warning to leave their territory, they were greeted. Commander Zixal's mechanical form shifted forward. Elaborate. The human captain invited our miners aboard their vessel for what they called coffee and conversation. Our people reported that the humans seemed excited to see them. They asked about galactic politics, trade routes, technological developments. They were particularly interested in learning about military capabilities and defensive positions of various species. The implications hung heavy in the chamber's recycled atmosphere. The humans weren't just building weapons, they were gathering intelligence. Ambassador Crevier's tentacles writhed in agitation. This suggests premeditation. They're planning something. There's more, Veltar said, his form now flickering rapidly with distress. During the conversation, one of the human crew members made a comment that our translators initially dismissed as a linguistic error. But, upon review, we believe it was intentional. What did they say? Elder Thexma asked, though part of her already dreaded the answer. They said, and I quote, "It's been 400 years since anyone came to visit. We've had plenty of time to think about old friends and old debts." The silence that followed was absolute. Every being in the chamber understood the implication. The humans hadn't forgotten why they had been exiled. They hadn't forgiven the species that had forced them into isolation after discovering what humans were capable of when truly angered. The historical records were sealed, accessible only to the highest levels of government. But every species leader knew the basic facts. Humans had been discovered approximately 500 years ago by a routine Zephyrian exploration fleet. Initially, they had been welcomed into the galactic community as an interesting but unremarkable species. They were bipedal, carbon-based, and possessed moderate intelligence and technological capabilities. What made them unique, the early reports had noted, was their unusual approach to problem-solving and their peculiar social structures. Humans seemed to form emotional bonds, not just with their own species, but with other life forms, including their machines, their planets, and even abstract concepts. They had a tendency to anthropomorphize everything, treating inanimate objects as if they possessed consciousness and feelings. For 50 years, humans had been productive members of the galactic community. They established trade relationships, shared their surprisingly effective agricultural techniques, and contributed their unique perspective to various scientific endeavors. Human art, music, and literature became popular throughout several sectors, particularly their stories about heroism and sacrifice. The problems began when the Devourers appeared. The Devourers were an ancient enemy that had plagued the galaxy for millennia, a mechanical race that consumed entire worlds to fuel their expansion. They had been dormant for over 1,000 years, leading many to believe they had finally been eradicated. When they returned, emerging from the dark spaces between galaxies, they brought with them technology and numbers that dwarfed anything the galactic community had faced before. The initial attacks were devastating. 3 entire star systems fell within the first month. The hegemony's legendary battle fleets, which had maintained peace for centuries, were swept aside like debris. The Kithara's psychic warriors, beings whose mental powers could level mountains, were overwhelmed by the sheer mechanical brutality of the Devourer forces. It was during the siege of Proxima's Sanctuary, a neutral world that served as a refuge for non-combatant species, that the galaxy first witnessed what humans were truly capable of when their moral boundaries were crossed. The human colony ship, New Horizons, had been in the system delivering medical supplies when the Devourers arrived. The ship's captain, a woman named Sarah Chun, had received evacuation orders along with all other non-military vessels. Instead, she had broadcast a message to the Devourer fleet that became legendary throughout the galaxy. "This is Captain Chun of the human vessel New Horizons. You are attacking civilians, including children from 17 different species. We're giving you one chance to withdraw. This is the only warning you'll receive." The Devourers, being machines, had no concept of warnings or mercy. They had responded by targeting the human ship with enough firepower to vaporize a battle cruiser. What happened next had been captured by sensor arrays throughout the system and was still studied by military academies across the galaxy, though the full footage remained classified. The human ship had not been destroyed. Instead, it had changed. Systems that hadn't existed moments before came online. Weapons that violated several laws of physics materialized along its hull. The modest colony transport transformed into something that made dreadnoughts look like children's toys. In 17 minutes, Captain Chun and her crew of 43 humans had eliminated an entire Devourer battle group consisting of over 300 ships, including their flagship, a vessel the size of Manhattan that had been previously considered indestructible. But it wasn't just the victory that had shocked the galaxy. It was how the humans had achieved it, and, more importantly, how they had reacted to achieving it. The sensor recordings showed human crew members weeping as they fought, their faces twisted with grief and rage. They had screamed at their enemies, not battle cries or threats, but expressions of pure emotional anguish. One communication fragment that survived the battle's electromagnetic interference captured a human gunner shouting, "You made us do this. We didn't want to be what we are." When Galactic forces arrived to assist with cleanup operations, they found Captain Shin sitting alone in her command chair, staring at the debris field that had once been the Devourer fleet. When asked how her ship had managed such a feat, she had given an answer that still haunted the dreams of every species leader who heard it. "We've always been able to do this. We just choose not to." Usually, the investigation that followed revealed the truth that the galaxy had been living with humans for 50 years without realizing what they truly were. Humans weren't just another intelligent species. They were something far more dangerous, a species that had achieved technological and military capabilities that dwarfed galactic civilization, but had deliberately chosen to limit themselves because they understood what unrestricted growth led to. Earth's history, when it was finally shared with galactic authorities, painted a picture of a species that had repeatedly brought itself to the brink of extinction through warfare, only to pull back at the last moment and rebuild. They had developed weapons capable of rendering their planet uninhabitable, then agreed to eliminate them. They had created artificial intelligences that could have replaced them entirely, then chose to remain biological. They had achieved space travel and terraforming technology centuries before making contact with galactic civilization, but had used it sparingly. Most disturbing of all, the investigation revealed that humans had been aware of galactic civilization for decades before first contact. They had been watching, learning, and deciding whether the galaxy was something they wanted to be part of. The recordings from the New Horizons incident showed why they had ultimately chosen isolation. After the battle, Captain Chun had made one final transmission. "We came to the stars hoping we could be different, hoping we could be better. But when push comes to shove, when innocent people are threatened, we become what we've always been. We become monsters. And the galaxy deserves better than monsters." The exile had been voluntary, technically. The humans had agreed to withdraw to their home system and limit their expansion to a carefully monitored zone. In exchange, the galaxy would leave them alone to find their own path. The technology limitation treaties had been their idea, a self-imposed restriction on weapon development and military expansion. For 400 years, the arrangement had worked. Humans stayed in their corner of the galaxy, the galactic community stayed in theirs, and everyone tried to forget that somewhere out there was a species that could potentially end galactic civilization if they chose to. Now, according to Veltar's report, the humans were building weapons again, and they were asking about old debts. Elder Thexma closed her 6 eyes and felt the weight of her 3 millennia of life pressing down on her. She had hoped to live out her remaining years in the peace that the Great Accords had brought to the galaxy. Instead, it seemed that the galaxy's greatest nightmare was about to become reality. "What do you recommend?" she asked, already knowing that there were no good options. "We need to know what they're planning," Commander Zixal said. "I volunteer to lead a diplomatic mission to human space. We need to understand their intentions before..." "Before what?" interrupted Ambassador Crevier. "Before they decide we've broken our agreement? Before they remember that we were the ones who forced them into exile? Before they conclude that we're a threat that needs to be eliminated?" The truth was that every species leader in the chamber knew exactly what they were dealing with. The humans hadn't been exiled because they were evil or inherently violent. They had been exiled because they were too effective at violence, and because their moral code meant that once they decided something was a threat to innocent life, they would pursue that threat to the absolute limits of their capabilities. The galaxy had spent 400 years building up military forces, developing new technologies, and expanding their territorial holdings, all while believing that the humans were safely contained in their small corner of space. Now they were discovering that the humans had spent those same 4 centuries doing exactly what humans did best, preparing for the war they hoped would never come, but that they would be ready for if it did. The massive weapon structure in human space wasn't just a violation of the treaties. It was a message. The humans were saying, in their characteristically direct way, that they were done pretending to be helpless. They were done being treated like a problem to be managed rather than people to be respected. And everyone in the chamber knew that when humans decided they were done with something, the results tended to reshape the galaxy. The emergency session continued for 17 hours, but no one present was under any illusions about what was coming. The galaxy's oldest and most carefully maintained agreement had been broken, not by the humans, but by the collective failure of every other species to understand that isolation was not the same as pacification. The humans were angry, and, as the old saying warned, that was something the galaxy was never supposed to allow to happen again. The diplomatic vessel Concordia materialized at the edge of the Sol system 3 days after the emergency council session, its quantum drives still humming with residual energy from the long journey. Commander Zixal stood on the bridge, his metallic form reflecting the distant light of Earth's sun as he studied the sensor readings that would have been impossible to believe if he hadn't seen them with his own optical sensors. The system had changed dramatically since the last official survey 400 years ago. What had once been a modest collection of planets with a single inhabited world now buzzed with activity that rivaled the galaxy's most advanced systems. Massive orbital installations surrounded every planet and most of the larger moons. Asteroid mining operations have been expanded to an industrial scale that dwarfed anything the galaxy had achieved. Most concerning of all, the space between planets was crisscrossed with energy signatures that suggested defensive networks of staggering complexity. "Sir," reported Navigation Officer Yeldana, a Kithera whose psychic abilities allowed her to sense technological emanations across vast distances. "I'm detecting at least 47 distinct artificial intelligence networks operating throughout the system. The complexity of their interactions is unprecedented." "Weapons?" Zixal asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Everything, sir. The entire system appears to have been converted into a fortress. But that's not the strangest part." She paused, her mental tendrils extending outward to gather more information. "Sir, they're welcoming us." Before Zixal could ask for clarification, the communication array activated with an incoming transmission. The main screen flickered to life, revealing the face of a human female who appeared to be in her 60s, with gray-streaked hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of decades of responsibility. Behind her, Zixal could see what appeared to be a command center that combined technology he recognized with systems that seemed impossibly advanced. "Commander Zixal of the hegemony vessel Concordia," the humans said, and her pronunciation of his name was perfect despite the linguistic challenges it presented. "Welcome to the Sol system. I'm Admiral Patricia Hawkins, currently serving as Director of External Relations for the Terran Federation. We've been expecting you." The casual nature of her greeting sent alarms through every sensor array on the ship. Humans were treating the arrival of a galactic military vessel as if they had invited dinner guests. "Admiral Hawkins," Zixal replied, his voice carefully modulated to convey formal diplomatic protocol. "I am here under authority of the Galactic Council to discuss recent developments that may impact the agreements established 4 centuries ago." Admiral Hawkins smiled, and Zixal found the expression unsettling. Human facial expressions had always been difficult for other species to interpret, but There was something in this particular smile that suggested the human knew far more about his mission than she should have. Of course, Commander. We have quite a bit to discuss, don't we? I'm transmitting approach vectors for Luna Station. I think you'll find our hospitality much improved since the last time we had galactic visitors. The transmission ended, leaving Zixal staring at coordinates that led to what his sensors were telling him was a moon-sized space station orbiting Earth satellite. The construction was obviously human in origin, but the scale suggested industrial capabilities that shouldn't have been possible given the resource limitations of the Sol system. Sir, Officer Yoldanis said, her voice tight with concern. I'm reading massive technological signatures from that station. The power output alone exceeds anything in the galactic databases. And, sir, there are humans already there waiting for us. Hundreds of them. As the Concordia approached Luna Station, Zixal began to understand the true scope of what the galaxy was dealing with. The station wasn't just large. It was beautiful in a way that no purely functional military installation should be. Its architecture combined flowing organic curves with geometric precision, creating something that seemed to grow naturally from the asteroid it was built around rather than being imposed upon it. More unsettling was the activity surrounding the station. Hundreds of ships moved in carefully choreographed patterns, ranging from small personal craft to vessels that rivaled galactic dreadnoughts in size. The coordination was flawless, suggesting either an artificial intelligence network of staggering sophistication or a level of human cooperation that defied everything the galaxy thought it knew about human social structures. The docking process was handled by systems that interfaced with the Concordia's navigation computers with an ease that should have been impossible. Different species use completely different technological paradigms, requiring complex translation protocols for even basic communication. The fact that human systems could seamlessly interact with hegemony technology suggested either decades of covert intelligence gathering or a level of technological advancement that made such concerns irrelevant. Admiral Hawkins met them at the airlock personally, accompanied by a small group of humans whose age ranges suggested they represented different generations of leadership. Zixal noticed immediately that none of them carried visible weapons, yet each moved with a confidence that suggested they considered themselves perfectly safe in the presence of potentially hostile aliens. "Commander Zixal," Admiral Hawkins said, extending her hand in the human gesture of greeting. "Thank you for making the journey. I know it represents a significant decision by the Council to establish direct contact after all these years." Zixal accepted the handshake, noting that the human's grip was firm but not aggressive. "Admiral, I must be direct. The Council has concerns about recent developments in this system. The construction of large-scale installations and apparent weapons systems represents a potential violation of agreements that have maintained peace for 4 centuries. "Of course," Admiral Hawkins replied, her tone remaining pleasant. "We understand the Council's concerns completely. That's why we've prepared a comprehensive briefing that should address all of your questions. If you'll follow me." The corridors of Luna Station revealed even more about how dramatically human capabilities had evolved during their isolation. The walls displayed real-time information about everything from agricultural production throughout the system to the current status of deep space exploration missions that apparently extended well beyond the boundaries of the Sol system. Most concerning were the tactical displays that showed defensive positions throughout local space, with threat assessment algorithms that seemed to be tracking not just the Concordia, but also several other vessels that Zixal's sensors hadn't detected. "How many ships do you have in this system?" he asked as they walked. "That's a complicated question," replied one of Admiral Hawkins' companions, a younger human male who introduced himself as Dr. James Chun. "It depends on how you define ship and whether you're including automated platforms, self-replicating mining vessels, and exploration probes. Our current active fleet includes approximately 12,000 vessels of various sizes and capabilities." Zixal's mechanical form actually stopped moving for a moment as he processed this information. 12,000 ships represented a fleet larger than most galactic species maintain for their entire military. The humans appeared to be treating it as a modest local defense force. The briefing room they entered was designed to accommodate multiple species, with adjustable environmental controls and seating that could adapt to various physiologies. The attention to detail suggested that the humans had been expecting galactic visitors for some time and had prepared extensively for the encounter. "Before we begin," Admiral Hawkins said, activating a holographic display system that rivaled anything in the Galactic Council chambers, "I want to address the fundamental misunderstanding that has apparently developed regarding human intentions and capabilities." The display showed a timeline stretching back 400 years, with markers indicating major events in both human and galactic history. Zixal immediately noticed that the human timeline included events from galactic history that should have been unknown to an isolated species. "We need to discuss the elephant in the room," Dr. Chen said, using a human idiom that the translation system struggled to render appropriately. "The galaxy seems to believe that we've been sitting here for 4 centuries, cut off from galactic civilization and slowly stagnating in our isolation. That's not what happened." "Explain," Zixal said, though he was beginning to suspect that he didn't want to hear the explanation. Admiral Hawkins touched a control, and the display zoomed in on a section of the timeline covering the past 50 years. "Commander, what do you know about the Kethran War?" The question sent a chill through Zixal's systems. The Kethran War had been one of the most devastating conflicts in recent galactic history, a 3-year struggle between the hegemony and a breakaway faction that had nearly resulted in the collapse of both civilizations. The war had ended suddenly, when the Kethran leadership had simply vanished, their entire fleet disappearing overnight without explanation. "The war ended through diplomatic resolution," Zixal said, repeating the official record. "No," Admiral Hawkins said quietly. "The war ended because we ended it." The holographic display shifted to show sensor recordings that Zixal recognized as being from the final battle of the war, when a massive Kethran fleet had been preparing to assault the hegemony's homeworld. But the recordings showed something that wasn't in any official report: the sudden appearance of ships with completely unfamiliar design signatures, vessels that had systematically disabled every Kethran vessel without destroying them or harming their crews. The Kethrans were using weapons that would have rendered 3-star systems uninhabitable, Dr. Chen explained. "Billions of innocent beings would have died. We couldn't allow that to happen." "But how?" Zixal asked. "Human ships were never detected in that region of space." "Because you weren't looking for human ships," Admiral Hawkins replied. "You were looking for the ships you remembered from 400 years ago. You weren't prepared to recognize what we had become." The implications were staggering. The humans hadn't been isolated at all. They had been actively monitoring galactic events and intervening when necessary to prevent large-scale catastrophes. They had developed technology that allowed them to operate throughout the galaxy without being detected by any of the major powers. "How many times?" Zixal asked. "How many times what?" Admiral Hawkins replied, though her expression suggested she knew exactly what he was asking. "How many times have you intervened in galactic affairs?" Dr. Chen and Admiral Hawkins exchanged glances before the Admiral activated another section of the timeline. Dozens of markers appeared, scattered throughout the past 4 centuries, each representing an event where human intervention had prevented or mitigated major disasters. 17 wars prevented before they could begin, Dr. Chen said. 43 natural disasters where we provided covert assistance. 12 first contact scenarios between species with incompatible biologies where we served as intermediaries. 6 attempts by various species to develop planet-killing weapons that we discouraged. And the recent construction that triggered this diplomatic mission? Zixal asked. Admiral Hawkins smiled again, and this time Zixal recognized the expression for what it was: sadness mixed with determination. "That's where things get complicated, Commander. We need to show you something that's going to be difficult to accept." The holographic display shifted to show a 3-dimensional map of the galaxy, with trade routes, political boundaries, and military installations marked in various colors. But overlaying all of this was another layer of information that made Zixal's optical sensors dim in shock. "This is what we've been monitoring for the past 200 years, Admiral Hawkins said. Commander, the galaxy is under threat from something that makes the old Devourer incursions look like minor inconveniences. And, according to our projections, you have less than 5 years before it arrives." The display zoomed in on a region of space beyond the galactic rim, where long-range sensors had detected movement that defied conventional physics. Massive structures, each the size of solar systems, were moving toward the galaxy at speeds that shouldn't have been possible. The energy signatures suggested technology that operated on principles that galactic science couldn't explain. "We call them the architects," Dr. Chen said. "They're not biological, not mechanical as we understand the term, and not artificial intelligence as any species has ever developed. There's something else entirely, and their purpose appears to be reshaping galaxies according to their own incomprehensible design. The weapon you detected isn't a weapon," Admiral Hawkins continued. "It's a construction tool. We've been building a defense network throughout the galaxy for the past century, hidden installations that can coordinate a response when the architects arrive. The structure in our system is the central coordination hub." Zixal's systems struggled to process the information. The humans hadn't been building weapons to threaten the galaxy. They had been building weapons to defend it. And they had been doing it without asking for permission, recognition, or assistance from the very civilizations they were protecting. "Why didn't you tell the Council?" he asked. "Because," Admiral Hawkins said, her voice carrying the weight of centuries of careful consideration, "the Council's first response would have been to panic, then to demand control of the defense systems, then to argue about resource allocation and command structure while the threat grew closer. We've watched galactic politics for 400 years, Commander. We know how these things go. And if your projections are wrong, if the architects don't represent the threat you believe they do." Dr. Chen activated another display, showing detailed analysis of architect technology and behavioral patterns observed in distant galaxies. "Commander, we've observed 17 galaxies that the architect have improved over the past million years. None of those galaxies contain any recognizable life forms anymore. The architects don't destroy life. They replace it with something they consider more efficient." The briefing continued for 6 hours, covering technology, strategy, and preparations that spanned centuries of human development. By the end, Zixal understood that the galaxy was facing a choice between accepting human protection or facing extinction when the architect arrived. But perhaps the most unsettling revelation was the realization that the humans had never stopped being what they had always been, a species that would sacrifice everything to protect innocent life, even when those innocents had exiled them, and spent centuries treating them as a threat to be contained rather than allies to be trusted. The galaxy's oldest commandment hadn't been broken by human anger. It had been broken by galactic pride, and now everyone would have to live with the consequences of treating humanity's greatest strength as their greatest weakness. The emergency recall of Commander Zixal's mission created ripple effects throughout the galaxy that no amount of diplomatic protocol could contain. Within hours of his encrypted report reaching the Galactic Council, every major species government was convening crisis meetings, military commanders were being pulled from retirement, and defense contractors were receiving procurement orders that hadn't been seen since the last Devourer incursion. Elder Thexma had lived through enough galactic emergencies to recognize the particular type of chaos that erupted when civilizations suddenly realized their fundamental assumptions about reality were completely wrong. The Kithara homeworld's capital city buzzed with activity as government officials, military leaders, and civilian scientists worked around the clock to verify the intelligence that Commander Zixal had brought back from human space. "The verification is complete," announced Prime Scientist Velthak, his mental emanations carrying the exhaustion of someone who had spent the past 72 hours analyzing data that challenged everything he thought he knew about galactic physics. "The human projections are accurate. We have independent confirmation of the architect approach from our deep space monitoring stations. The assembled leaders of the HFY Council absorbed this information with the practiced calm of beings who had survived 3 millennia of galactic politics. But Elder Thexma could sense the underlying terror in their mental signatures. The Kithara were one of the galaxy's oldest species, with psychic abilities that allowed them to perceive events across vast distances. If they were afraid, there was good reason for fear. "How long do we have?" asked General Mordek, the Council's chief military advisor. "According to human calculations, confirmed by our own analysis, the Architect Vanguard will reach the outer rim of our galaxy in 4 years, 7 months, and approximately 3 days," Velthak replied. "The main force will arrive roughly 18 months later. And the human defense preparations? That's where this situation becomes complicated," Elder Thexma said, activating a holographic display that showed the intelligence gathered from dozens of covert operations that had been launched immediately after Zixal's report. The humans haven't just been building defenses for 5 years or 50 years. They've been preparing for this threat for over 2 centuries. The hologram revealed the true scope of human activity throughout the galaxy. Hidden installations on uninhabited worlds, automated mining operations in remote asteroid fields, and, most shocking of all, a network of artificial intelligence systems that have been quietly observing and analyzing every major species' military capabilities, technological development, and strategic vulnerabilities. "They've been watching us," General Mordek said, his mental signature radiating a mixture of admiration and unease. "All of us. For centuries. More than watching," corrected Intelligence Director Kretal. "They've been preparing contingency plans for every possible scenario. Our analysis suggests they have detailed strategic assessments for defending not just their own territory, but every inhabited system in the galaxy." The scope of human preparation was staggering. They had identified choke points in galactic space lanes, calculated optimal defensive positions for every major species, and developed tactical doctrines that took into account the unique capabilities and weaknesses of hundreds of different alien military forces. Most unsettling of all, they had done this without any guarantee that the species they were preparing to defend would accept their help when the time came. "There's something else," Elder Thexma said, her ancient voice carrying the weight of a decision she had hoped never to make. "The humans have made a formal request to address the Galactic Council. They're asking for permission to begin open coordination of galactic defense preparations." The silence that followed was profound. In 400 years of isolation, humans had never requested to address the Council. They had never asked for anything from the galactic community except to be left alone. The fact that they were breaking that pattern now indicated that the situation was even more serious than the data suggested. "What are they offering?" asked Counselor Valera, one of the younger members of the Assembly. "Everything," Elder Thexma replied. "Complete technological sharing, full disclosure of their defense preparations, and coordination of their AI networks with galactic military forces. They're also offering to share the predictive models they've developed for architect behavior and capabilities." And were they asking in return? That's the truly remarkable part, Elder Thexma said, accessing another section of the intelligence report. "They're asking for nothing except the opportunity to save as many lives as possible when the architects arrive." The human request had been accompanied by detailed technical specifications for defensive systems that operated on principles that galactic science was only beginning to understand. The technology gap between human capabilities and the rest of the galaxy had become a chasm during their centuries of isolation. Yet instead of using their technological superiority as leverage for political concessions or territorial gains, they were offering to share it freely. "It could be a deception," suggested General Mordek, though his mental signature suggested he didn't really believe it. "A way to gain control of galactic military forces by positioning themselves as indispensable." "To what end?" Elder Thexma asked. "If the humans wanted to control the galaxy, they could have done so at any time during the past 2 centuries. Their technological capabilities already exceed our combined military forces by orders of magnitude. The intelligence reports made this uncomfortably clear. Human ships operated on propulsion principles that allowed them to traverse the galaxy in weeks rather than months. Their weapons could disable enemy vessels without harming crew members, or alternatively, could eliminate entire fleets with the press of a button. Their artificial intelligence networks processed information at speeds that made real-time tactical coordination across galactic distances possible. Most significantly, the humans had solved the fundamental logistics problem that limited all galactic military operations: resource scarcity. Their automated manufacturing systems could convert raw asteroids into fleets of warships in a matter of months. They had turned their entire solar system into a factory that operated at industrial scales that defied economic theory. We need to consider the possibility, Elder Thexma continued, that the humans have become something that transcends our normal understanding of species limitations. They may have evolved beyond the need for territory, resources, or political dominance in ways that we find difficult to comprehend. The psychological profiles that Galactic Intelligence Services had compiled on human behavior supported this theory. Humans consistently prioritized long-term species survival over short-term individual or national gains. They had repeatedly demonstrated willingness to sacrifice their own interests for the protection of others, even when those others had treated them as threats or outcasts. The question, said Counselor Valera, is whether we can trust them. The question, Elder Thexma corrected, is whether we can afford not to trust them. Similar conversations were taking place throughout the galaxy as every major species grappled with the reality that their carefully maintained political balance had become irrelevant overnight. The Zephyrian Empire's crystal cities hummed with activity as their leaders debated whether to accept human assistance or attempt to mount an independent defense. The Traitors' Alliance calculated the economic implications of galactic warfare on a scale that would make normal commerce impossible. The hegemony's military commanders studied human tactical doctrines and tried to understand how an entire species could coordinate military actions with the precision of a single organism. But perhaps the most significant development was taking place on Proximus Sanctuary, the same neutral world where Captain Sarachun had first demonstrated human military capabilities 4 centuries earlier. The world had become a symbol of galactic cooperation and peaceful coexistence, home to a multicultural society that included representatives from dozens of species. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the current director of Proximus Sanctuary and a direct descendant of one of the original human colonists, found herself in the unprecedented position of serving as an unofficial liaison between human representatives and galactic authorities. Her unique position as a human who had lived her entire life outside the Sol system gave her insights into both human and galactic perspectives. The fundamental misunderstanding, she explained to a gathering of diplomatic representatives who had come to Proximus Sanctuary seeking neutral ground for preliminary discussions, is the assumption that humans view this as a human problem with a human solution. The delegates, representing 12 major species and dozens of smaller ones, listened with the desperate attention of beings who were grasping for any framework that would help them understand what was happening. Humans don't see the architect threat as an opportunity to prove their superiority or gain political advantage, Dr. Vasquez continued. They see it as an existential crisis for all intelligent life in the galaxy. Their response isn't motivated by human interests. It's motivated by their fundamental inability to stand by and watch innocent beings suffer when they have the power to prevent it. Ambassador Crevier of the Traitors' Alliance, her tentacles writhing with agitation, voiced the concern that haunted every delegate present. But what happens after? If we accept human protection, if we integrate our forces with their systems, what guarantee do we have that they won't use that integration to dominate us permanently? Dr. Vasquez smiled with an expression that somehow managed to be both sad and reassuring. Ambassador, you're still thinking in terms of traditional power politics. The humans stopped caring about dominating anyone 400 years ago. They care about survival. Not just human survival, but the survival of intelligence, creativity, and consciousness in all its forms. She activated a holographic display that showed the long-term human projections for galactic development. The scenarios painted a picture of a future where different species maintained their cultural autonomy while collaborating on challenges that no single civilization could address alone. It was a vision of cooperation rather than domination, growth rather than conquest. The humans aren't trying to save the galaxy so they can rule it, Dr. Vasquez explained. They're trying to save the galaxy so that every species can continue to become whatever they're meant to become. They see their role as gardeners, not conquerors. The metaphor resonated with several of the delegates, particularly those from agricultural species who understood the difference between nurturing growth and controlling it. But others remained skeptical, their species' histories filled with examples of powerful civilizations that had begun with noble intentions before succumbing to the corruption of absolute power. How can we be certain of their intentions? Asked Delegate Morphex of the Symmetrist Coalition. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. This is a universal truth that applies to all intelligent species. Because, Dr. Vasquez replied, the humans have already had absolute power for centuries, and they chose isolation over dominion. They've had the capability to conquer the galaxy for longer than most species have had spaceflight, and instead, they've spent that time protecting it in secret. The delegates struggled with this concept because it challenged fundamental assumptions about how power functioned in galactic politics. Every species that had achieved significant technological or military superiority had eventually used that superiority to expand their territory and influence. The idea that a species could possess overwhelming power and choose not to use it for personal gain was nearly incomprehensible. What if you're wrong? Asked Elder Zimtalk of the collective consciousness, whose species communicated through shared mental networks. What if accepting human assistance leads to human dominance, regardless of their stated intentions? Dr. Vasquez considered the question carefully before responding. Then, we'll deal with that problem when it arises. But, right now, we have a more immediate concern. What happens if we reject human assistance and face the architects alone? The answer to that question had been calculated by every major species strategic planning committees, and the results were universally grim. Current galactic military capabilities, even if perfectly coordinated and supported by every available resource, would delay architect conquest by perhaps 6 months at most. The technological gap was simply too vast to overcome with conventional strategies. The humans aren't asking us to surrender our autonomy, Dr. Vasquez continued. They're asking us to work together to survive. And after 400 years of watching how they handle power, I'm inclined to trust their definition of cooperation. As the preliminary discussions continued on Proximus Sanctuary, similar debates raged throughout the galaxy. Some species advocated for immediate acceptance of human assistance. Others pushed for independent resistance efforts. And still others suggested attempting to negotiate directly with the architects when they arrived. But beneath all the political maneuvering and strategic planning, a simpler truth was becoming apparent. The galaxy's carefully maintained balance of power had already been irrelevantly obsolete for centuries. The humans had quietly evolved beyond the need for traditional conquest, while the rest of the galaxy had continued playing political games that no longer mattered. The question now was whether galactic civilization could evolve quickly enough to accept help from the species they had exiled for being too powerful, too dangerous, and too willing to sacrifice everything for the protection of others. The Galactic Council Chamber had never hosted a session quite like this one. For the first time in 400 years, a human stood before the assembled representatives of galactic civilization, not as an exile seeking permission to return, but as someone offering salvation to those who had cast them out. Admiral Patricia Hawkins stood calmly in the center of the vast spherical chamber, her simple blue uniform contrasting sharply with the elaborate ceremonial garments worn by the hundreds of alien delegates surrounding her. She had arrived not in a massive dreadnought designed to intimidate, but in a modest transport vessel that had requested permission to dock with the same polite formality used by tourist ships. Honored beings of the Galactic Council, Admiral Hawkins began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's translation systems. I come before you today not to discuss old grievances or past mistakes, but to address a future that we must face together or not at all. Elder Thexma, presiding over what many suspected would be the most important council session in galactic history, noted the careful precision of the Admiral's words. There was no accusation in her tone, no reference to the exile or the centuries of isolation that had followed the Proxima Sanctuary incident. The human was treating the assembled delegates not as former adversaries, but as colleagues facing a common threat. You have reviewed our intelligence regarding the architect approach, Admiral Hawkins continued, and your own scientists have confirmed our projections. I am here to present our recommendations for coordinated defensive preparations and to answer any questions you may have about human capabilities and intentions. Ambassador Veltar of the Zephyrian Empire rose first, his crystalline form catching the chamber's ambient light as he formulated his question. Admiral Hawkins, your species has demonstrated technological capabilities that exceed our combined military forces by significant margins. Why should we believe that this offer of assistance isn't simply a more sophisticated form of conquest? It was the question that every delegate in the chamber wanted answered, phrased with diplomatic courtesy, but carrying the weight of 4 centuries of carefully maintained suspicion. Admiral Hawkins considered the question for a moment before responding. Ambassador Veltar, I understand your concern. Power without accountability has historically led to abuse, regardless of the species wielding it. But I would like to offer a different perspective on what power actually means. She gestured, and the chamber's central holographic display activated, showing a 3-dimensional map of the galaxy with thousands of points of light representing inhabited systems. For the past 2 centuries, human forces have maintained covert observation posts in over 3,000 star systems. Our artificial intelligence networks have monitored communications, tracked military movements, and analyzed resource flows throughout galactic civilization. We have possessed complete intelligence on every species' strategic capabilities, political vulnerabilities, and economic dependencies. The implications of this revelation sent murmurs of alarm through the chamber. The humans had been conducting surveillance operations that dwarfed anything in Galactic Intelligence Service's capabilities. If our intention was conquest, Admiral Hawkins continued, we could have accomplished it at any point during the past century without any species even realizing they were being invaded. Instead, we used this intelligence to prevent wars, mitigate disasters, and protect civilian populations during conflicts that could have escalated beyond control. She activated another section of the display, showing detailed records of human interventions throughout recent galactic history. The scope was staggering. Conflict prevented through carefully timed intelligence leaks, natural disasters mitigated by anonymous resource deliveries, and first contact scenarios managed through covert diplomatic channels. True power, Admiral Hawkins said, is not the ability to dominate others. True power is the ability to choose not to dominate when you easily could. We have made that choice repeatedly for 200 years. Commander Zixal of the Hegemony, who had spent the past weeks analyzing every detail of his visit to human space, rose to ask the next question. Admiral, your defensive preparations appear to be based on coordination between human artificial intelligence systems and galactic military forces. How can we be certain that such integration won't compromise our operational independence? An excellent question, Commander, Admiral Hawkins replied. Rather than explain our protocols, I think it would be more effective to demonstrate them. She touched a control device on her wrist, and instantly every delegate in the chamber received a direct information download through their personal communication systems. The data transfer was seamless, instantaneous and somehow customized for each species' technological standards despite the vast differences in their information processing methods. What you have just received, Admiral Hawkins explained, is complete technical documentation for our defensive coordination protocols, including source code for the AI systems involved, strategic assessments for every inhabited system in the galaxy, and detailed projections for resource allocation during the Architect conflict. The chamber erupted in stunned silence as delegates realized the implications of what had just occurred. The humans had not only shared their defensive plans, they had shared everything. Technical specifications that most species would consider state secrets had been transmitted openly to every government in the galaxy. Security through transparency, Admiral Hawkins continued. You now have access to the same information that guides our strategic planning. You can verify our intentions, analyze our capabilities, and make informed decisions about the level of cooperation you're comfortable with. Elder Thexma activated her personal analysis systems and immediately understood the magnitude of what the humans had just done. The technical documentation included not just defensive systems, but manufacturing processes, resource management algorithms, and technological principles that were decades or centuries ahead of galactic science. The humans had just handed over knowledge that could revolutionize every aspect of galactic civilization. Admiral Elder Thexma said, her ancient voice carrying the weight of 3 millennia of political experience. This level of technological sharing represents a transfer of power that could destabilize every existing political and economic structure in the galaxy. Why would you risk such disruption? Admiral Hawkins smiled with the same sad expression that Commander Zixal had found so unsettling during his visit to human space. Elder Thexma, because those political and economic structures are about to become irrelevant anyway. The architects don't negotiate with governments or respect territorial boundaries. They don't care about our trade agreements or military alliances. When they arrive, every species in this galaxy will face the same choice. Adapt to a reality that makes our current political systems obsolete, or be replaced by something the architects consider more efficient. She activated another holographic display, this one showing detailed analysis of architect technology and behavioral patterns observed in distant galaxies. The images were disturbing, worlds that had been systematically stripped of all biological life and rebuilt according to geometric patterns that served no comprehensible purpose. Stellar systems whose energy output had been redirected to power massive computational networks. And space itself reorganized into structures that operated according to physical laws that galactic science couldn't explain. The architects don't destroy civilizations, Admiral Hawkins explained. They improve them according to their own definition of improvement. Individual consciousness, cultural diversity, and biological evolution are inefficiencies that they correct through replacement with integrated synthetic systems. The delegates studied the images with growing horror. The architect improvements had eliminated not just intelligent life, but all life, replacing entire ecosystems with self-maintaining mechanical networks that operated with perfect efficiency and absolute sterility. How do we fight something like this? Asked Ambassador Crevier. Her tentacles curled with distress. We don't fight them, Admiral Hawkins replied. We convince them that our galaxy has already achieved the efficiency they seek, but through methods that preserve rather than eliminate individual consciousness and cultural diversity. This was the most audacious aspect of the human strategy. Instead of preparing for a military conflict with the architects, they were preparing to demonstrate that galactic civilization had already evolved beyond the inefficiencies that the architects typically corrected through replacement. The coordination networks we've been building, Admiral Hawkins explained, are designed to create the appearance of perfect efficiency while actually preserving the independence and autonomy of every participating species. We're preparing to show the architects that biological consciousness can achieve coordination that rivals their synthetic systems without requiring the elimination of individual thought and cultural expression. The strategy required a level of cooperation between species that had never been achieved in galactic history. Every military force would need to operate as part of a perfectly synchronized network. Every resource allocation decision would need to be optimized across the entire galaxy, and every species would need to subordinate their immediate interests to long-term collective survival. The technological systems we're sharing with you today, Admiral Hawkins continued, are designed to make this possible. Our artificial intelligence networks can coordinate military actions across galactic distances in real time, optimize resource distribution to eliminate waste and inefficiency, and translate between species that have never successfully communicated directly. But the most remarkable aspect of the human proposal was its voluntary nature. Unlike typical military integration, which required subordinate forces to follow orders from a central command structure, the human systems were designed to coordinate independent decisions made by autonomous commanders. Each species maintains complete control over their own forces, Admiral Hawkins explained. Our AI systems simply ensure that your independent decisions are informed by perfect information about galactic conditions and optimized to complement actions being taken by other species. You retain your command authority. We simply make it possible for that authority to be exercised with complete situational awareness. Dr. Elena Vasquez, attending the session as an observer representing Proxima Sanctuary, watched the delegates process this information with a mixture of hope and concern. The human proposal addressed every practical obstacle to galactic cooperation, but it also challenged fundamental assumptions about sovereignty and independence that had defined galactic politics for millennia. There is one more thing, Admiral Hawkins said, and her tone suggested that she was approaching the most difficult part of her presentation. The coordination protocols work best when they include behavioral prediction algorithms for all participating species. This requires psychological profiling and cultural analysis that some of you may consider invasive. She activated a new display showing the kind of information that would be gathered, decision-making patterns for individual commanders, cultural values that influence strategic thinking, and psychological responses to stress that affected battlefield performance. The level of detail was comprehensive enough to predict how specific individuals would react in situations they had never encountered. We understand that this raises concerns about privacy and manipulation, Admiral Hawkins acknowledged. But warfare against the architects will involve scenarios that none of us can fully prepare for through conventional training. The ability to predict how allied forces will respond to unprecedented situations could be the difference between successful coordination and catastrophic miscommunication. The session continued for 18 hours, with delegates asking detailed questions about every aspect of the human proposal. Gradually, a consensus began to emerge among the assembled species. The human strategy represented their best hope for survival, but implementing it would require changes to galactic civilization that were almost as radical as the architect threat itself. When the formal presentations concluded, Elder Thexma called for a recess before the final vote. The delegates would need time to consult with their governments and consider the full implications of what they were being asked to accept. As Admiral Hawkins prepared to leave the chamber, Elder Thexma approached her with a question that had been troubling her throughout the session. "Admiral," she said, "why are you doing this? Your species could survive the architect arrival by retreating to heavily defended systems and waiting for the situation to stabilize. Why risk everything to save civilizations that exiled you?" Admiral Hawkins paused at the chamber's exit and looked back at the assembled delegates, most of whom were engaged in urgent discussions with their respective governments. "Elder Thex_Ma," she said, "for 100 years ago, my people chose exile because we couldn't bear the thought of becoming the monsters that others feared we were. Today, we're making a different choice. We're choosing to become the protectors that others need us to be, regardless of whether they want our protection or not." She smiled one final time before departing. Besides, a galaxy without Kithera philosophy, Zephyrian art, or hegemony engineering would be a much poorer place. Some things are worth saving even when they don't want to be saved. 3 years later, the galaxy had become something unrecognizable. The transformation began slowly, then accelerated beyond anything the species who lived through it could have imagined. What started as emergency military coordination evolved into the most profound revolution in galactic civilization since the development of faster-than-light travel. The humans, true to their word, had not conquered the galaxy. Instead, they had helped it become something greater than the sum of its parts. Admiral Patricia Hawkins stood on the observation deck of Harmony Station, the massive coordination hub that had been constructed at the galactic core where the old council chambers once stood. The station itself was a marvel of cooperative engineering, incorporating architectural principles from dozens of species into a structure that somehow felt familiar to everyone who entered it. Through the massive transparent aluminum windows, she could see the constant flow of ships representing every known species in the galaxy. Zephyrian crystal transports carried Kythera philosophers to conferences with hegemony engineers. Trader Alliance vessels loaded with exotic materials docked alongside human manufacturing ships that would convert those materials into defensive systems within hours. Most remarkably, the traffic flowed with a precision that made the station space lanes look like a choreographed dance. "The morning briefing is ready," announced Arya, the artificial intelligence coordinator whose consciousness spanned the entire galaxy while maintaining individual communication nodes for each species according to their cultural preferences. For humans, Arya appeared as a warm female voice with just enough personality to feel approachable. For the Kythera, she manifested as harmonic mental emanations. For the Zephyrians, she communicated through modulated light patterns that felt like crystal song. "Thank you, Arya," Admiral Hawkins replied. "Any developments overnight?" 17 positive developments and 3 concerns requiring senior attention, Arya responded. "The collective consciousness has completed integration of their hive mind with our coordination protocols, increasing our tactical response time in their sector by 47%. The Symmetris Coalition has finished construction of their assigned defensive platforms ahead of schedule. And, remarkably, the Traders Alliance has managed to establish profitable commerce in defensive materials with species they've never successfully negotiated with before." The changes in galactic society had been as dramatic as the military preparations. Species that had maintained minimal contact for centuries were now working together on engineering projects that required intimate knowledge of each other's capabilities and limitations. Cultural exchange programs had emerged spontaneously as different species realized that understanding their allies' perspectives improved coordination efficiency. "The concerns?" Admiral Hawkins asked, though she suspected she already knew what they were. "First, long-range sensors have detected Architect scout elements entering the Outer Rim regions. They appear to be conducting systematic reconnaissance of galactic defensive positions. Second, we're receiving reports of contact attempts by the scouts with several Rim-world civilizations. Third, there are signs that some species may be attempting to negotiate separately with the Architects rather than maintaining unified resistance." This was the scenario the human strategic planners had identified as the greatest risk to galactic defense coordination. Despite 3 years of preparation and integration, some species remained convinced that they could achieve better outcomes through individual negotiation than through collective resistance. "Which species?" Admiral Hawkins asked, though Arya's hesitation already provided the answer. "The Devonian Republic and the Stellar Confederation have both established communication channels with Architect scouts," Arya replied. "Intelligence suggests they're attempting to position themselves as willing collaborators in exchange for preserved autonomy within Architect-managed territory." Admiral Hawkins sighed, a sound that carried the weight of centuries of human experience with the tragic predictability of civilizational politics. Even when facing extinction, some groups would attempt to secure their own survival at the expense of collective security. "Options. The integration protocols provide for this scenario," Arya responded. "We can maintain defensive coordination with loyalist forces while implementing containment procedures for potential collaborator territories. However, This approach reduces overall defensive efficiency by approximately 12% and creates vulnerabilities that the architects will certainly exploit. Alternative approaches? Admiral Chun has requested permission to implement her grandmother's protocols. Admiral Hawkins felt a chill that had nothing to do with the station's environmental controls. Admiral Lisa Chun, great-granddaughter of the legendary Captain Sarah Chun, who had first revealed human capabilities to the galaxy, commanded the Seoul Defense Fleet, and had inherited her ancestors' combination of tactical brilliance and absolute moral conviction. Arya, please clarify what Admiral Chin means by her grandmother's protocols. Admiral Chin believes that species attempting to collaborate with the architects represent a clear and present danger to galactic survival. Arya replied with clinical precision. Her recommendations include immediate military intervention to prevent collaboration attempts, forced integration of collaborator species into unified command structures, and, if necessary, preemptive elimination of leadership elements that refuse to comply with galactic defense coordination. The suggestion was tactically sound and strategically logical. It was also exactly the kind of authoritarian overreach that had led to human exile 400 years earlier. Admiral Hawkins realized she was facing the same choice that had confronted Captain Sarah Chun: become the monster that others feared in order to protect innocent life, or allow those innocents to suffer for the sake of maintaining moral principles. Denied, Admiral Hawkins said firmly. We don't save civilizations by destroying their autonomy. Admiral Chin anticipated that response. Arya continued. She has requested a direct conference to present alternative protocols that may address your concerns. The holographic communications system activated, revealing Admiral Lisa Chun aboard the bridge of her flagship, the inevitable Resolution. Behind her, Admiral Hawkins could see displays showing real-time tactical information from throughout the galaxy, with particular focus on the Rim territories where Architect scouts were making contact with local governments. Patricia, Admiral Chin said without preamble, we have a problem that goes beyond simple collaboration attempts. The Architects aren't just offering individual species preservation in exchange for cooperation. They're offering advancement. Explain. The Scout contacts include demonstrations of Architect enhancement technologies. Admiral Chun continued, activating displays that showed intercepted communications between Architect scouts and Rimworld governments. They're showing species how they can be improved through integration with Architect networks, expanded lifespans, enhanced cognitive capabilities, perfect coordination between individuals, and elimination of the resource conflicts that drive most interspecies warfare. Admiral Hawkins studied the intercepted communications with growing concern. The Architect offers weren't threats of conquest or demands for submission. They were invitations to transcendence, presented in terms that many species would find genuinely appealing. Some species are viewing this as an opportunity rather than a threat, Admiral Chin explained. They see Architect integration as voluntary evolution rather than forced replacement. The Devonian Republic's leadership has publicly stated that they consider Architect enhancement preferable to what they call primitive biological limitations. And the Stellar Confederation? They're more calculating. Their analysis suggests that early cooperation with the Architects will position them as administrators rather than subjects in the new galactic order. They believe they can maintain cultural autonomy while gaining access to Architect technology. Admiral Hawkins recognized the trap that the Architects had laid. By presenting integration as improvement rather than conquest, they were exploiting the same intellectual curiosity and ambition for advancement that had driven galactic civilization's development for millennia. What are you proposing? Admiral Hawkins asked. Counter-demonstration, Admiral Chin replied. We show the galaxy what human enhancement technologies can offer without requiring integration into external networks. We prove that biological consciousness can achieve transcendence without surrendering individual autonomy. The proposal was audacious even by human standards. Admiral Chun was suggesting that humans reveal technologies they had kept secret for centuries capabilities that went far beyond even the advanced systems they had already shared with galactic civilization. Lisa, you're talking about technologies that we agreed should never be deployed. The enhancement protocols carry risks that Patricia, Admiral Chun interrupted. The time for maintaining those restrictions has passed. Either we demonstrate what voluntary enhancement looks like, or we watch species choose involuntary integration because it's the only transcendence option they're aware of. Admiral Hawkins understood the logic, but she also understood the consequences. Human enhancement technologies have been developed and then deliberately abandoned after their creators realized the potential for abuse. Capabilities that could expand consciousness, extend lifespans, and enhance cognitive abilities came with corresponding risks of addiction, identity dissolution, and social stratification that could destroy the cultural values that made enhancement worthwhile. "Show me the protocols," Admiral Hawkins said. The holographic display shifted to show technical specifications for enhancement systems that operated on principles similar to architect integration, but preserved individual consciousness and cultural autonomy. Instead of replacing biological systems with synthetic alternatives, the human technologies enhanced existing capabilities while maintaining the neural patterns that defined individual identity. The key difference, Admiral Chen explained, is that our enhancement is reversible. Individuals can experience expanded consciousness, enhanced coordination, and extended capabilities without permanent modification to their fundamental nature. They can taste transcendence without surrendering their identity. And the risk of addiction, the social disruption, managed through graduated implementation and psychological support systems, Admiral Chen replied. We don't offer enhancement to entire populations simultaneously. We offer it to volunteers who understand the risks and benefits, with full support for those who choose to reverse the process. Admiral Hawkins realized that Admiral Chun was proposing to transform galactic civilization twice. First by offering alternatives to architect integration, then by managing the social and psychological consequences of enhancement technology that could fundamentally change how intelligent life developed throughout the galaxy. Time frame for implementation. The architect main force will arrive in 18 months, Admiral Chen said. If we begin enhancement demonstrations within the next 60 days, we can provide viable alternatives to architect integration before species make irrevocable decisions about collaboration. The decision carried implications that stretched far beyond the immediate architect threat. If humans began sharing enhancement technologies, they would irreversibly alter the trajectory of galactic evolution. Species that had taken millions of years to develop their current capabilities could achieve transcendence within decades. ARIA analysis? Admiral Chen's proposal addresses the immediate strategic threat while creating long-term consequences that cannot be precisely predicted, ARIA replied. However, analysis suggests that species choosing architect integration represent a threat to overall galactic survival that outweighs the risks associated with human enhancement alternatives. Opposition. Significant concern from several species about the pace of technological and social change, ARIA reported. However, polling data suggests that 73% of galactic population would prefer human enhancement options to architect integration if given adequate information about both alternatives. Admiral Hawkins realized that the galaxy was facing the same choice that had confronted humanity 4 centuries earlier. Embrace capabilities that could lead to transcendence or domination, or maintain limitations that preserved familiar social structures at the cost of missing evolutionary opportunities. Approved, Admiral Hawkins said, but with strict protocols. Enhancement demonstrations must be voluntary, reversible, and accompanied by comprehensive psychological support. No species receives enhancement technology without full understanding of alternatives and consequences. Understood, Admiral Chen replied. And Patricia? Thank you. My grandmother always said that the hardest decisions were the ones that mattered most. As the communication ended, Admiral Hawkins looked out at the galaxy the humans had spent 3 years helping to transform. The architects would arrive in 18 months to find a civilization that had achieved coordination without surrendering diversity, efficiency without eliminating individuality, and transcendence without abandoning the biological consciousness that made transcendence meaningful. Whether that would be enough to convince ancient beings who had spent millions of years replacing inefficient biological life with improved synthetic alternatives remained to be seen. But for the first time since the architect threat had been identified, Admiral Hawkins felt something that resembled hope. The galaxy's oldest commandment had been broken. Humans had become angry, not at the species that had exiled them, but at the forces that threatened to eliminate everything that made galactic civilization worth preserving. And their anger had transformed them not into conquerors, but into gardeners of transcendence. The architects would discover that this galaxy had already been improved by species that understood the difference between advancement and replacement, between enhancement and subjugation, between evolution and extinction. And if the architects couldn't appreciate that difference, well, humans had 400 years of suppressed capabilities they were finally ready to demonstrate.